Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I see people continuing to populate in, but ladies and gentlemen, good evening. And thank you for joining us for the Naval War College Foundation's 9th Newport Lecture Series presentation of the 2022 to 2023 academic year, New U.S. Initiatives in the Arctic, Dealing with Changing Realities. As we approach double digits in the number of our Newport Lecture Series presentations, that usually means graduation is nearby. And in fact, the June commencement ceremony is scheduled for the Friday, June 16th for the class of 2023. And our very best to all of the graduating students. And of course, congratulations to the faculty for yet another successful year of getting one of the largest classes that convenes throughout the year at the U.S. Naval War College out the door and onto their next duty station. I am George Lang, CEO of the Naval War College Foundation. As always, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our virtual guest speaker series that convenes monthly during the college's academic year and is generously underwritten by the estate of Trustee Emerita Barbara and Mr. Herbert Epstein. The Naval War College Foundation remains grateful for their very kind and thoughtful generosity. I also wish to thank Chairman Bilden, our esteemed Board of Trustees, members, friends, and benefactors, as well as my staff for their continued support and commitment for the rewarding missions of the U.S. Naval War College and Naval War College Foundation. Enabled and strengthened by our generous Patriotic Foundation members, including many of you this evening, the U.S. Naval War College has continued its innovative cutting-edge education and research, scholarship, and wargaming programs that have sustained it as the nation's leading institution and standard bearer for professional military education. Additionally, since I mentioned Chairman Bilden, in just a few short weeks, he'll be turning the con over to Chairman-elect Daniel E. Holland III. Dan will relieve Philip after Philip's 3-year tour as chairman during the Naval War College Foundation full Board of Trustees meeting on Monday, 12 June. Thank you, Chairman Bilden, for your exceptional leadership and unprecedented support, and congratulations, Dan. As always, the Naval War College Foundation is proud to support the U.S. Naval War College and its critically important mission to deliver excellence in education and research, and remains steadfast in its commitment to provide the resources needed to advance the college's many priorities, including research and scholarship, curriculum and instruction, endowed chairs, faculty and student academic achievement awards, conferences and symposia, regional international studies, and capital improvements. Tonight's presentation, again, is only a small snapshot of the scholarly work U.S. Naval War College students are immersed in during their short 10-month accredited academic year at the college. Military and federal service civilian students alike have attended studies here in Newport, including many notable flag officers and distinguished civilian executives, such as Admiral Scott Swift, United States Navy retired, Admiral Mike Rogers, United States Navy retired, General David Rodriguez, U.S. Army retired, Dr. Clifford Stanley, Major General, United States Marine Corps retired, Admiral Robert Papp, Jr., U.S. Coast Guard retired, and of course, Carlos Del Toro, our 78th U.S. Secretary of the Navy. As a matter of routine, should you have any questions come to you during the presentation, please submit them via the Q&A box, and I'll be happy to present them to our guest speaker during the Q&A session. We'll get to as many questions as time will allow this evening. Now to introduce and welcome you, distinguished guest speaker for tonight's presentation. She's just this week served as a distinguished panelist for our James E. Hayes Chicago Endowment Luncheon at the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, A Blue Arctic and the Future of American Power. She did a phenomenal job, and we're fortunate to host her again this evening. Dr. Mary Thompson-Jones is a career diplomat, professor, and published author on U.S. foreign policy and the practice of diplomacy. Her book, To the Secretary, Leaked Embassy Cables and America's Foreign Policy Disconnect, was praised by Joseph Nye as a fascinating account of how diplomacy really works from the bottom up. Mary is currently a professor in the National Security Affairs Department at the U.S. Naval War College, where her areas of expertise include the Arctic. Before coming to the U.S. Naval War College, she directed a master's program at Northeastern University. Her research interests include international diplomacy, the intersection of cultural diplomacy and international higher education, and U.S. foreign policy in the geographic regions of Europe and Latin America. Mary's diplomatic experience spans a 23-year career as a foreign service officer in leadership roles in the Czech Republic, Canada, Guatemala, Spain, and Washington, D.C. She attained the rank of minister counselor while serving as a charge d'affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Prague, where her portfolio included missile defense negotiations, the Czech entry into the visa waiver system, and the Czech presidency of the European Union. She oversaw 2 visits from President Barack Obama, Secretary Hillary Clinton, several cabinet secretaries, and numerous congressional delegations. In other overseas postings, she was a counselor for public diplomacy who orchestrated embassy work on media outreach programs and academic exchange programs. Mary also served as the State Department's diplomat in residence for the New England region, and she was a former dean of international graduate programs at Endicott College. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Mary Thompson-Jones. Mary, over to you.
Thank you very much, George, for a very kind introduction. Before I begin the topic, I want to steal back 30 seconds from this topic to say thank you. As a rank and file member of the Naval War College on the faculty, I have personally been the beneficiary of the Foundation's largesse, and many of my colleagues have also availed themselves of the fantastic opportunities to advance our research, to attend conferences, to present at panels, and to provide our own input into the intellectual community surrounding the many topics that you've been hearing about in the course of this year, which the Arctic is only one of them. So thank you very much for that support, and I am inspired to continue researching because of your support. Secondly, I have to offer the by now very common disclaimer that the views you are about to hear and see are my own. They do not represent the US government, the Department of Defense, or even the Naval War College. They're simply my views. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So I'd like to cover 4 topics this evening. They're by no means the only topics in which we've seen a lot of change in the Arctic. In fact, I would say that this has been an absolute watershed year in terms of US policy, US recognition, US conversations about the Arctic, what we're trying to do, what we understand our own situational awareness to be, what our national goals are. And it's been a very exciting period for scholars and policymakers alike. So beginning with the policy part, I would contend that both branches of government, of the 3, Congress and the executive, have really rediscovered the Arctic region. And what do I mean by that? Well, in the first place, we've seen an absolute avalanche of Arctic strategy reports. We've seen these from the very top of government, the White House National Strategy for the Arctic region. We've also seen the Department of Defense issue a national strategy. We've seen all the branches of the service issue national strategies, as well as the Department of Energy and the Department of Homeland Security. So in terms of production of paper, coordination, and new thinking about the Arctic, there's plenty of evidence that something's going on. There's also a plethora of Arctic offices. Some of these are brand new, like Department of Defense's Arctic Strategy and Global Resilience Office and Department of State's Office of the Coordinator for the Arctic Region. Others of these are re-envisioned, reimagined, reshaped to focus on different issues. And as you see, the list that I've given here is by no means complete, but it gives you a sense of the breadth and depth of interagency US government interest. Now, some people would argue that I'm on weak ground to use bureaucracy and bureaucratic politics to establish the importance of the Arctic. On the other hand, there is something to be said for aligning offices, making people more cognizant of what is going on. And if this were a be-all end-all, I would agree, this says nothing but that bureaucracy is alive and well. But if we see this as symptomatic of a renewed US interest and a rediscovery, then I think it's more interesting. So let's look at the uppermost strategy, which is the national U.S. Arctic strategy, which was issued by the White House back in October of last year. This is interesting because it's been 10 years since the last time the United States did a national Arctic strategy. That was back in 2013. And if you think back to 2013, the world looked a lot different in previous decades. Much has changed in terms of our understanding of the region, our awareness of it, what science and technology have brought, and also political developments in the region. I would say it's high time for waiting 10 years maybe is too long. What's new and interesting and different about it is that this Arctic strategy, in departure from being primarily a military strategy, also addresses climate change with greater urgency, and it focuses more on the community aspects of the Arctic. This is something that was not well thought out 10 years ago, and certainly is a development that is welcomed, I think, by all. The photo that I'm illustrating this slide with is an iconic photo taken of a village in Alaska, Shishmaref. The photo illustrates the two most fundamental problems for many Arctic villages, not only in Alaska, but in our neighbors in Canada, in Nunavut as well. We're seeing examples of coastal erosion, as well as permafrost thaw, which is resulting in collapse of infrastructure, of roads, of buildings, of houses. In this case, it required an entire community being relocated. And we're talking about Native Alaskan communities. This has added poignancy because the ties that these communities have based on their ancestral connections, their lifestyles and their seasonal cycles are quite intense and quite deep. And there's a lot of pain involved in relocation, no matter who's fitting the bill. In this case, there's federal funding coupled with Alaskan state funding to do that relocation. The question is, will the new sites for new villages be safe, or will they ultimately also be subjected to some of these same climate change problems? So yes, the Arctic strategy also focuses more on the residents themselves and their plights, and we'll get more into that later in the talk. So the administration built 4 pillars to its Arctic strategy, and no surprise, the first one is security, enhanced deterrence capabilities, which is a constant and a thread through previous strategies. It connects quite closely to the national security strategy, which was published about the same time as the Arctic strategy, and which is of course much more comprehensive. The other part of the security pillar also echoes themes in the national security strategy, more coordination with partners and allies. This has been a theme we've seen in the Biden administration, shoring up that coordination, tightening partnerships. That's been particularly important since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I've mentioned climate change, environmental protection. The administration calls out the state of Alaska, talks about its obligations as well as the need to do federal state management together. It also talks about improving understanding of Arctic ecosystems. And this, I think, is a recognition that although the United States has been in the forefront with world-class scientific research published in esteemed peer-reviewed journals about what's going on in the Arctic, it is fair to state that it is still a very understudied, under-researched, and less understood region of the world. There's lots of room for more research. Also, when you consider the fact that the Arctic is changing at 4 times the rate of the rest of the globe in terms of climate change, the dynamics of that and the rapidity of that mean that research also has to ramp up to keep up with some of the second and third order effects of climate change and unexpected consequences of climate change. The third pillar is sustainable economic development. This is a commitment by the US government to do more investment in infrastructure, improve access to services, and to support growing economic development. I think that's one of the more exciting pillars. I think there's great potential, great opportunity to do more in the Arctic, and that can't happen without better infrastructure, as we'll see toward the end of this talk. And finally, the administration saw fit to talk about some of the more venerable and successful Arctic institutions, none more so than the Arctic Council. And many of you probably know that the United States was one of the founding members of the Arctic Council, which consists of the 8 Arctic states, including Russia. The Arctic Council has a rotating chair, and as it happened, Russia held the chair during its invasion of Ukraine. The US and its partner countries on the Arctic Council decided that the only response was to pause activities in the Arctic Council. And I should say the Arctic Council, as part of its charter, does not touch on defense or security measures. Its areas of expertise are sustainable development and economics and environmental protection. So this pause threw the future of the institution into serious doubt. As it has worked out in just the previous few weeks, the successor, as was planned, to the Russian chair was Norway, and there was a handoff from Russia to Norway. Norway, since I think May 11th, has held the chair. The US has stated its intention to fully cooperate and re-engage in activities under the leadership and direction of the Norwegian chair. Many long-term Arctic Council observers are still troubled because there is no mechanism for reintroducing Russia to the Arctic Council. It, of course, controls 52% of the Arctic territory, and it's hard to imagine accomplishing much without Russia. It is equally hard to imagine inviting Russia back in anytime soon. So we will have to see how things unveil and roll out with the Norwegian chairmanship. I think it's important also to look at other branches of the US government, and Congress has also sharpened its focus on the Arctic region. It's done so in a number of different ways. In the photograph you see below, we see the Standing Committee of Arctic Parliamentarians. This is co-chaired by Senator Lisa Murkowski, Republican of Alaska, and the people seated around the table are elected officials from the other Arctic nations discussing issues at the international level. Mostly, of course, Congress works at the domestic level, and there's been a lot of activity there too. The National Defense Authorizations Acts of 2022 and 2023 have included an increasing number of provisions for the Arctic. Most of these, given the intent and heft of the bill, are national security oriented. Others of them are focused more on economics and expanding services to Alaskan area residents. But in general, it's a national security emphasis. And while the NDAA is by no means only about the Arctic, it's a watershed moment that so much attention and time and funding through the NDAA process was focused on the Arctic region. So, having mentioned Lisa Murkowski, let me mention 2 other key senators. They comprise key leadership in the Arctic Caucus. Murkowski currently is co-chair along with Senator Angus King, who's an independent from the state of Maine, and I'll have more to say about Maine later on. And equally dynamic is Senator Dan Sullivan, the other senator from Alaska, who has really made Arctic national security a focus for a lot of his programs and has been very active. What's surprising to me, and perhaps to you, is that other senators are also members, and they range from states that seem logical, like Washington State, Minnesota, okay, but also Louisiana, Illinois, other states that feel they have, if not direct national security interests, then certainly business and economic interests in the Arctic, and they have supported the Arctic Caucus and are in fact the 10 members of it. So that's been an interesting development as well. So moving to the second part of my presentation, I wanted to talk about how the US government has revitalized Arctic diplomacy. Probably not a surprise given my background as a former Foreign Service officer. I was one of those who cheered when the US consulate in Nuuk, Greenland reopened. And the photo you see there is indeed the US consulate with the seal just to the left of the door. I went and visited it a few weeks ago when I was in Greenland. It's fascinating because only Iceland, in addition to the US, currently has a formal diplomatic presence. It's a situation that is delicate. It has to be negotiated with Denmark, which still has control of Greenland's foreign security policy. Greenland is under home rule and self-rule. It handles all other aspects of its affairs as a nation state, but not the foreign affairs. So establishing or reestablishing, in this case, a consulate was no mean feat. It took a lot of negotiation and a lot of emphasis on areas in which the consulate would work, which would be non-defense and security related. But I think the argument in favor of this is that in order to exert diplomacy and in order to reaffirm any sort of Arctic power, you have to have presence. And we now have an official US diplomatic presence in Nuuk. Here's an example of some of the activities taking place. We have public affairs, public diplomacy, outreach. The woman you see looking at the map is a regional English language officer, and she's visiting Greenland and going on a trip along the western coastline of Greenland, accompanied by US consular officers, to make trips to schools and educational institutions to provide support for English language teaching. It's pretty obvious why the US government would have an interest in promoting the English language. We're interested in educational and economic exchanges of all kinds, all the way up to the Fulbright program. And being proficient in English is always the gateway to other opportunities. And engaging with Greenlandic people it's essential that they have some understanding of English if they would like to come to the US and study in our universities. Likewise, it's important that Americans become more acquainted with Greenland. There is now a university. There are active exchange programs in a few US colleges and universities, and one can only hope that that will grow. Other activities of the US consulate include encouraging investment and development, tourism, and other kinds of educational exchange and people-to-people programs. So it's not just the Department of State, it's also the Department of Defense that has focused on diplomatic outreach type activities. And this one is more important than you might think. This just happened in the last month, the renaming of Thule Air Base. I still call it Thule, and I imagine some of you know it that way too. But its Greenlandic name is Bidufik. And in addition to no longer being an air base, it's also now a space base, Space Force base. And there you see the official ceremony in which the base was renamed. It's still a small base. There are 140 airmen and a lot of contractors. And that's really the subtext for this story, because back in 2014, the base decided, as the traditional decades-long renewed contract with Danish/Greenlandic service and maintenance companies ended, that they would let the contract and prefer an American company. This created incredible heartburn and bad feelings among Greenlanders, and was a sticking point in talks with the base on lots of other issues, not all of which were related to that. So just prior to renaming the base, the US signed a new contract, and you can see this is not small potatoes. This is $4 billion to a jointly owned Greenlandic Danish company with minority US ownership to handle the maintenance and operations. This, I think, has been received well. You see Greenland's Minister of Foreign Affairs as one of the participants unveiling the sign, along with Ambassador Leventhal, US Ambassador to Denmark, and other officials from Space Force celebrating this change. And lastly, we also have the nomination, at least, for the first ever Arctic ambassador. This is a person that is well known to almost everyone in the Arctic research community, Dr. Michael Strejve. He's former chair of the Arctic Research Commission. He's at the Wilson Center for a long time. He helped establish the Fulbright Arctic Initiative, and he's a lifelong career geographer, spent a long time at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Hard to imagine anyone more qualified to do this kind of work. And there you see him with Senator Murkowski, who was a leading advocate for the need to have an Arctic ambassador, wrote many op-eds about it, pushed the State Department to do this, and the State Department has nominated, but not the Senate has yet to confirm Dr. Strejve. Why is this important? Why am I adding this to the list? Because it closes leadership gaps and it allows the interagency to work better. If you remember the slide with all the new offices and reimagined, reinvigorated offices, it's more important than ever to coordinate across US government. And that can be accomplished by having a permanent ambassador and an office set up to support him or her. Even more important is at the international level, because many other countries, all other Arctic countries, have Arctic ambassadors, and many near Arctic states, non-Arctic states also have Arctic ambassadors. So we will now have someone who can deal with them as equals and who can articulate US policy as dynamic as it is. So I think this too is a diplomatic milestone. So looking at the third pillar, third part of this presentation, is the science, research, technology aspect of this. And here too, this just happened. These are the ski birds, 3 LC-130s, and they come from the New York Air National Guard, and they're there to help the National Science Foundation, which runs the Summit Station. These planes are really the lifeline for scientists who have been there for a long time. This is not new. There has been research going on for a long time. The research is more important than ever. And if you would like to see where the Summit Station is, it's in the little star right there, smack in the middle of Greenland, where there is nothing. What there is the ice shield, and that is one of the highest points on the ice shield and one of the most fruitful places in which scientists can do research. And these are certainly not posh conditions. This is one of the buildings in the research station. Scientists are there to monitor equipment, do intensive work, and given the nature of Greenland, they do most of their work in the summer months. So the first C-130 came up in April, and the last one will leave in August, and scientists will collect their data, and for the most part, we'll go back, although there are some year-round projects that continue. Another aspect of this is the use of institutions to support the Arctic beyond government. We had the US-Greenland Joint Committee meeting, also just in the last 6 months. And this is a combination of Danish, Greenlandic, and American officials who were talking in this particular meeting mostly about the energy and mining sectors, along with scientific collaboration and other soft policy kinds of programs. And I was intrigued that they chose Maine as their venue. This happens to be at Bowdoin College, and it keeps the East Coast somewhat connected to Arctic developments, which leads to a logical way to segue out of Greenland and look at some of the other places that are also doing interesting things. So of course, let's talk about Alaska. In specific, I'd like to mention the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies. This is one of the results of a prior NDAA congressional authorization. It gets the 6th DoD Regional Center up and running. It's located at JBER, Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, and it has a triple mission of engagement, outreach, education, research, analysis. It is slowly standing up while it is on the base. It's housed in a former elementary school, and the elementary school is under construction, renovation, in part because of asbestos, in part because of other modifications. So hopefully they will have a real home to hang their hat soon. In the meantime, they've certainly made outreach a key part of their mission. They co-hosted an important security and defense conference in Greenland, along with Greenlandic and Danish co-sponsors. They are off to Garmisch sometime this summer, and they'll continue to take their show on the road to do the kind of outreach and public affairs that's such an important part of these regional centers. And doubling back to Bowdoin again, I put this slide in because it is a representation of so much of what is going on in American academia. Bowdoin has a long history with the Arctic because it's been home to the Perry Macmillan Arctic Museum for nigh 100 years. The Bowdoin University saw fit to renovate the building, build a new structure, house the Arctic Securities or Arctic Studies program as well, and to give new impetus and new life to current programs, which are interesting because of their interdisciplinary nature. We see work being done in archaeology, ethnography, anthropology, geology, many of the hard sciences as well, literature, linguistics, and the entire panoply of academic disciplines has really opened up. Bowdoin is hardly alone. There are lots of other US universities in Washington State. Of course, Alaska, both University of Alaska Fairbanks and Anchorage are among the premier Arctic institutions, but they're joined by a lot of colleagues in the lower 48, which I also find heartening and a great signal that the US is finally seizing hold of the importance of the region. I mentioned Maine earlier, and I think that the appropriate place to talk about Maine is in terms of Arctic economic development, not only for the Arctic, but for the state of Maine as well. Ameskip, an Icelandic shipping company, relocated from Norfolk, Virginia to Portland, thanks to a lot of coaxing and a lot of strategic thinking by state of Maine officials. And I am amazed that despite supply chain disruptions, all those photos we saw a year ago of congestion in the Port of Los Angeles and other places, that Ameskip was able to increase its shipping by 25%. Other Icelandic companies have joined Ameskip. So there's the North Atlantic Cargo Line growing exponentially. And Iceful also growing just unbelievably. And I think just the figure that impresses me the most is the fact that AIMSCIP shipped 38,200 containers to the port of Portland in last year, in 2022. Why is this so successful? Because Maine is willing to invest as well. 100 million for a state of that size is impressive. And about half of that funding has gone to a cold storage warehouse. And what is intriguing for AIMSCIP, and I imagine other companies, is the fact that it connects to a rail line. So you have effectively roll-on, roll-off opportunities for a lot of the container shipping into other parts of North America. So lastly, the value of a community-based approach is one of the administration pillars and something that's caught my attention as well. 10 years ago, very few researchers or policymakers were talking about the people and the inhabitants of the Arctic. They are admittedly few in number, 4 million in total. The entire population of Alaska, our own Arctic, is only 750,000. Of that, the population of people actually living north of the Arctic Circle is relatively small. But the importance of consulting and learning from and being engaged with Arctic communities has really undergone a sea change. I would suggest that's true in Canada as well. Looking at Nunavut, part of this has been the pain of going through the residential homes scandal. In our Scandinavian friends, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, the Sami people have expressed similar concerns, and all three governments have set up truth and reconciliation committees to provide a platform for more discussions. But that's looking backward. Looking forward is what's intriguing for me. And what we're starting to hear from scientists is that it doesn't make sense to sit in Northern Virginia and look at data about an area in which there are actual living residents with whom one could consult, collaborate, and engage with. And more of that is happening than ever before. I think that can only improve the science and the outreach and the utility of the findings. So while there are some good aspects of that, there are also some important negative aspects. And there's no point in talking about what's happening in Alaskan native villages in the Arctic region without at least touching on the big problems: housing, water, sewage, broadband. There are others, but let this suffice. Housing, I've touched on. Housing is insecure because of climate change. But what many people in the lower 48 do not know is that water is a problem, along with sewage and connectivity and all the problems that arise from not having that. This is probably the hardest slide to look at. This is about water. Specifically, it's about the lack of means to pipe in running water. Alaska keeps tallies of the number of homes that are unpiped, not a word that we use much down here, and the quantity of fresh water available based on severe shortages of water and the health consequences of not having enough water. What you're looking at in the photo is a system of open lagoons, and this is how communities have no alternative but to dispose of household sewage. These are carried by hand in buckets, dumped into an open lagoon. The white you see is plastic. The buckets that people use are lined with plastic. Then they're pulled out of the buckets are dumped. You see one sitting there underneath or on top of the yellow pillar. There are some real health costs to this, and I am glad to see that both the federal government and the state of Alaska are trying to take action, difficult as that is, given the challenges in remote communities that are not well connected, where there are no economies of scale whatsoever. But 1 in 3 infants will be hospitalized because of diseases that are directly attributable to lack of water. And there are higher incidences of lots of respiratory and other ailments connected with this that will persist through children's time. On the other hand, while there has been difficulty with connectivity, here are some quotes that, how frustrating it is. You want to download a grant application so that you can apply for community assistance to get broadband, but you can't download the application because you don't have the connectivity to do it. And it's very, very expensive. Imagine paying $314 a month for internet. That's a lot to pay. On the other hand, we are starting to see some programs that may actually come to fruition. The infrastructure bills, the pandemic funding has finally begun to make a dent in that. And certainly there's a lot of interest in the state of Alaska level, pressure both at the congressional level and state level to do more with that. So to end on a slightly more optimistic note, infrastructure is also marine-based, maritime-based, and one of the new developments is that the Port of Nome is getting America's only deep water port. This is funded directly through the NDAA, and this has really been Senator Dan Sullivan's pet project, and he's been pretty tireless in advocating for that. It serves a lot of different purposes. It's certainly part of the economic development of the region. It was advertised as being about national security, but it's also a way to grow a part of the Alaskan coastline that hasn't had a lot of economic investment or development. And the argument in favor of doing it is that traffic has increased dramatically. In fact, it has doubled since 2009. I'm sorry, the numbers don't show up so well. There were 262 vessels that transited the Bering Strait, the coast of Nome, and by 2021, that number was up to 555. The colored chart on the right-hand side shows the intensity of that traffic. And when you consider that the Bering Strait is only 55 miles across, and the number of purposes, different kinds of vessels, fishing, obviously, military, other kinds as well, tourism, certainly we'll see an uptick in that this coming summer. There's significant evidence that maybe it is time to have a deep water port. So that touches on at least 4 areas that intrigue me, that I follow in my research, and I'd love to talk to you about it. And if I were to sum up the talk, it's really the heartening message that there's increased recognition of the importance of presence. Presence is important because it's integral to national security. I think presence works best when it is not just military, but rather interagency, whole of government, when there's lots of private sector involvement as well, when there's economic development, particularly in the face of foreign competition, and when it's done in consultation with communities. So George, I'll leave it there, and I look forward to taking some questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. Yeah, exceptional brief. You covered kind of all aspects of looking at the national security issues of the Arctic, which is helpful for me to better understand it. Is there a combatant commander? Now, I mean, I guess I should know. Is there a combatant commander responsible for the Arctic region? Is it
Yes, it has been long debated. There are 3 that touch on it. If we're looking at Europe, of course, EUCOM, for the European area, NORTHCOM. There's also NORAD, which is just a US-Canada organization, and then Indo-PACOM, particularly when we're talking about the Bering Strait. So yeah, one issue in terms of bureaucratic organization, which I alluded to earlier, is deciding who's in charge. Does it make sense to have 3 areas of responsibility looking at this? Certainly NATO, and the fact that we're in the midst of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that we're watching the integration of Finland, and hopefully after this weekend and Turkish second round of elections, the entry of Sweden as well into NATO, and the nexus between EUCOM and NATO argues that the European Arctic is its own issue. There's, thanks, I think, to the kind of issues that the Ted Stevens Center is raising, there's a new cognizance of a North American Arctic, where Greenland, Canada, USA are all linked on the Arctic opposite Russia. And then, of course, given China's intense interest in becoming a global power, and certainly it has been evident in the Arctic as well as many other places, Indo-PACOM certainly has a dog in the fight as well.
Yeah, no, well, thank you for that. And before I open up the floor for other questions, of course, if anybody in the audience, if you've got a question, please. I see we've got one right now in the Q&A box, so we'll get to that in just a second. But I'm just wondering, so during the 10-month resident course here at the college, how much is the Arctic addressed, either in the core program or elective programs? I mean, how do students here who might be going to UCOM, NorthCom, Indo-PACOM, and might have to be dealing with these challenges, how much do you think they're being read into all of these challenges, which you've outlined several here tonight?
Well, I can comment best on the Department of National Security Affairs, because that's my home within the college. And I can't really speak to the other core courses, JMO and S&P. But within the National Security Affairs Department, we definitely cover the Arctic region through the international securities side of the core subcourse that we offer. I have to say there are other opportunities as well. I'm currently supervising a thesis by a student in the Advanced Strategies program. And you mentioned the electives program, and that's been a phenomenal opportunity. Many of us faculty have taught there. Colleagues that you and I both know well, Walter Burbrick and Admiral Lars Solness, have co-taught an Arctic class for several years. Mm-hmm. I myself have taught an elective class 3 times called Imagining the Arctic. I hope to resume that when I return from sabbatical, armed with some new research, particularly about Greenland. So I think there's growing opportunities. Students in the International Securities program are required to write a fairly substantial research paper, and some of them also elect to look at the Arctic. It's their choice. They can pick any part of the world or any issue they would like, but it's been interesting to see an uptick in that as well.
Yeah. Well, very good. And again, thank you for your support earlier this week, as well as we continue to look at the Arctic. And you did a superb job with your 2 colleagues, Dr. Walter Burbrick and Rear Admiral Lars Solness. So again, ladies and gentlemen, Q&A boxes, please submit any questions as they come to you. We've got 2 now, one from Daniel Stewart. How does the U.S. compare with China with respect to ethnic Arctic cultural engagement? How does the U.S. compare?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I'm not sure that China is particularly focused on ethnic Arctic engagement. I think the fact that, I mean, if we're talking about ethnicity, I'm interpreting your question to mean Native Alaskans, tribal peoples of the Arctic, Native peoples. Assuming that, then I would add that I think the U.S. has an interesting history in Alaska, because shortly after Alaska became a state, we did something completely different. Instead of establishing the old model of Indian reservations, we did something really quite revolutionary. we encouraged tribal organizations to form native corporations. There are 21 native corporations in Alaska, and they take control of their economic decisions, their investment decisions. Some of the native corporations are quite wealthy. They are on the North Slope. They control a lot of what happens in Prudhoe and other places. Others are Bristol Bay, more involved in fishing. Nana, another one, investing heavily in broadband right now and managing a multi-billion-dollar US grant. So the record is mixed, as it is with all US engagement with Native communities. On the other hand, I think that the Native corporation aspect is one of the more distinctive facets of Alaskan history. And you don't see that replicated, certainly not in China, and not even in Canada or Europe that I'm aware of.
Interesting. From Sean Kelleher, for public-private partnerships, has there been engagement with the Alaskan Native corporations on community and infrastructure development in the Arctic? Seems they would have a lot of expertise and equity and development in this area, which I think you kind of allude to a little bit.
Yeah, I think the NANA example, which is a acronym for one of the 21 Native corporations, is a great example. And the fact that they were able to take advantage of pandemic funding and then possibly infrastructure funding as well to apply for and successfully receive a fairly substantial federal grant to work on the broadband problem is heartening. Not to shortchange the state of Alaska, the governor has set up a number of commissions over the years looking at this, and it's no easy task. Alaska is the least connected of any of the 50 states, and there are formidable challenges. As I mentioned earlier, no economies of scale because of the sparse population, and great need, great cost to do all this. And that's the economic puzzle. There have been some companies that went under, that operated fraudulently. Quintillion was one of the ones that was notorious for having promised bad broadband and never delivering. Technology is starting to help, and there may be solutions that look different than what would have been the case 10 years ago.
Yeah. This next question, thank you for that. This next question, and I see it actually came to me during the presentation too, is aligned with the COCOM question, is there a lead service in the Arctic that has responsibility for national security? Michelle Shallop says, thank you for the great presentation. I enjoyed the multipolar Arctic elective course as a student. My question is, what opportunities do you see for the U.S. Coast Guard in advancing security in the Arctic? So again, kind of that service-oriented, Air Force, you could say, has got Space Force, or what is there kind of a lead service? And of course, what opportunities are there for the Coast Guard?
Well, let me take the Coast Guard question first, because this is an exciting time for the Coast Guard. After years of bemoaning the lack of icebreakers, had I done this talk 4 years ago, I would have been talking about icebreakers. I didn't even mention them, not because the problem is solved, but because the problem is on the way to being solved. Congress has seen fit to fund 6 icebreakers. 2 of them are currently under construction. There are some interesting amendments and initiatives within Congress to see if a few might be bought ready-made off the shelf, so to speak, from our allies who do this very well, Finland, among others. And if that happens, that would speed up the process. The Coast Guard does heroic things in the Arctic with one icebreaker that is, I think, 45 years old at last count, and still, pasted together with, duct tape and sealing wax and wire and whatever initiative they can use. But the disconnect between what's being provided to the Coast Guard to do the job we've asked them to do and the growth of the job is just, well, it's a disconnect. The number of tourist cruises going through are more than ever. Now that COVID is behind us, well, at least mostly behind us, and people are willing to travel, there's a lot of last chance tourism going on. People want to see the Arctic before it melts, before it's too late. They want to see an iceberg. They want to see the northern lights. And we've seen some near misses. Several years ago, there was a cruise ship off the coast of Bono in Norway that ran aground, and 400 mostly elderly cruise ship passengers had to be evacuated at night under heavy seas by helicopter, which is not ideal. Miraculously, the Norwegians did an amazing job. It was off their coast, so it's not really an issue for the US Coast Guard, but it's not hard to imagine repeated incidences of this happening and the Coast Guard being called more and more frequently to do the kinds of rescues that are challenging and dangerous, and more Americans and others trying to transit the Arctic being at risk. Simply the lack of ice does not mean that it's smooth sailing. And we're not at the point where there's a lack of ice yet. And in some scenarios, we will see stronger storms and more difficult weather conditions. And of course, what will never change is the fact that it will always be dark in the Arctic 6 months a year. And rescues that happen under darkness have an additional challenge to them.
Yeah.
The lead agency, the Air Force has really stepped up in JBER. Again, I think this is the work of Senator Sullivan. They now host most of the F-35s, along with others, but they are by no means the only service that has rediscovered Alaska. The Army is doing more cold weather training there, as well as, again, in Norway, as the Marines have done over and over again in recent years. The Navy, I think, is ambivalent about the deep water port of Nome once it is built and how it might be used. But the pressure on the US Navy to come up with some kind of important Arctic presence is not going to diminish. And the Navy may continue to find it a distraction. It has other priorities elsewhere, but I don't think it will be able to dodge meaningful discussions with Congress in the future.
Yeah, no, thank you. We're right at 6:59. It's a beautiful night out, so I imagine people are going to want to try to get outside and go for a walk. So maybe one more question quick. No mention of unclose. This is from John Gilman. No mention of unclose. When are we going to address this? We're losing out on a validity of a substantial continental shelf claim. Is the congressional delegation from Alaska active in this?
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. I think the administration has kind of thrown in the towel. Both Republican and Democratic administrations, going back to the Reagan administration, have decided there just simply isn't support in the Senate to ratify the treaty and get the 2/3 plus 1 vote that would be necessary. We comply as though we were signatories, but you are 100% right. It puts us at a legal and policy disadvantage. And I don't see any prospect, particularly given the tenor of discussions in Congress these days, for that to change anytime soon, unfortunately.
Well, Mary, thank you again. It's been an honor and a privilege to host you tonight. You've been a terrific friend of the foundation and have often readily offered to support the many events of the foundation, particularly during my tenure. So we appreciate you taking time out of your very busy schedule, again, to share your knowledge and expertise with us this evening. So thank you. Thank
you, George. And thanks to all the participants. Have a great Memorial Day weekend. Bye-bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes tonight's lecture. Our next presentation won't be until later this summer when we kick off the series with the new academic year. In the meantime, keep your eyes and ears open regarding our Newport National Security Symposium scheduled for Thursday, 17 August. We are actively building out that program, and additional details will follow shortly. Updates to this presentation and others can be found on our webpage at navalwarcollegefoundation.org/our-tech-events. As always, we continue to seek to expand our membership, individual and corporate, and raise awareness of the great institution, which is the U.S. Naval War College. And we invite you to join us in this charge. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you need any unique gift ideas for friends and families, consider giving them a tax-deductible gift of membership to Naval War College Foundation, so they too can stay abreast of key issues affecting our national security and democratic way of life. Everything you need to know about joining the Naval War College Foundation or giving a gift of membership can be found on our website under membership. Thank you again for tuning in tonight and for your continued support for the rewarding missions of the U.S. Naval War College and Naval War College Foundation. Have a great rest of your evening. It's beautiful outside. Get out, get some fresh air. Thanks so much. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.